"Sir, step aside. Right now." The words landed before Marcus Bellamy's boarding pass had even finished scanning. The gate agent's voice was flat, final, already decided. Behind him, 43 passengers watched a black man in a charcoal suit get pulled out of the boarding line like a piece of luggage flagged for inspection. Nobody explained why. Not yet. Marcus Bellamy was 41 years old, and by 7:52 that morning, he had already been awake for 3 hours. He had reviewed a term sheet worth $340 million, answered 9 emails from his general counsel, and folded a suit jacket into a garment bag with the kind of precision that comes from doing something 1,000 times. He founded Aerotheon Systems 9 years earlier, in a 2-bedroom apartment in Charlotte, North Carolina, with $6,200 in savings and a laptop that overheated if you ran 2 windows at once. Now, Aerotheon's scheduling software ran the gate operations for 11 regional carriers and 2 of the 5 largest airlines in the country. People who had never heard his name flew safely home every day because of code his company had written. He kept one thing from those early years in his breast pocket: a small, tarnished airline wing pin, the kind ground crew used to get after 10 years of service. It had belonged to his father. Walter Bellamy spent 31 years loading bags onto planes at Charlotte Douglas International Airport. 31 years of 4 a.m. shifts, torn rotator cuffs, and a uniform that never quite fit right, no matter how many times he had it altered. He never once sat in a first-class seat. Not one time in 31 years on an airline he helped keep flying. He used to tell Marcus, when Marcus was young enough to still ask why, that some doors don't open because you're not tall enough to reach the handle. They open because somebody decided, a long time before you got there, that the handle wasn't for people like you. Walter Bellamy died 4 years ago, on a Tuesday, in a hospital room with a view of a parking garage. Marcus flew first class for the first time 3 weeks later, on a flight he didn't remember boarding. He wore the pin every time he flew since. Every single time. This particular Thursday, he was flying from Charlotte to Denver for a keynote at an Aviation Innovation Summit, Seat 2A, ticket number AER 88213, purchased 11 days earlier for $1,842.60. He had a folder of slides on artificial intelligence in airport logistics that he'd rehearsed twice in the hotel mirror the night before. He had allowed himself 90 extra minutes at the gate, specifically so nothing could go wrong. Something went wrong anyway. Her name was Denise Holloway, 46 years old, 18 years with Palisade Airlines, a woman who prided herself on running the tightest gate in Concourse D. She had a laminated card in her pocket, listing every FAA regulation by number, and she quoted them the way other people quote scripture. Her coworkers called her thorough, her supervisor called her reliable. Neither word, it would turn out, meant what everyone assumed it meant. At 8:04 a.m. Denise Holloway watched Marcus Bellamy walk toward the jet bridge with a boarding pass in one hand and a leather satchel in the other, and she made a decision in under 2 seconds that would take the rest of the day and the rest of her career to unmake. "Let me see that again," she said, though she had already scanned it once, and the screen had turned green. Marcus handed it back without a word. She scanned it a second time. Green again. Name matched the ID. Seat matched the manifest. Fare class matched the ticket. Nothing on the screen said anything, except go ahead. She looked at the screen, then at him, then back at the screen. The way a person looks at a math problem they've already decided has the wrong answer. "I'm going to need you to step to the side," she said. "We have to verify something." Behind him, a man in a Patagonia vest walked past with an identical first-class boarding pass, got a smile and have a great flight, and disappeared down the jet bridge without breaking stride. Marcus stepped aside. Pay attention to that pin in his pocket. It's going to matter more than anyone standing at that gate could possibly imagine. For 6 minutes, nothing happened except waiting. Denise made a phone call that Marcus couldn't hear the other end of. She typed something into her terminal, deleted it, typed it again. A woman in the boarding line, maybe 60, glanced over twice, opened her mouth, and then closed it, deciding, the way most people decide every single day, that it was easier to assume there was a reason. At 8:11, Denise Holloway picked up the gate microphone. "Ma'am, sir, we're going to need everyone in the first-class line to hold for a moment while we resolve a documentation issue." There was no documentation issue. There had never been a documentation issue. There was a boarding pass that had scanned green twice, held by a man whose skin color did not match some picture in Denise Holloway's head of who was supposed to be sitting in seat 2A. She said it loud enough for 30 people to hear. She said his row number. She did not say his name, because at that point, she hadn't bothered to learn it. Marcus Bellamy stood at the podium's edge, with his satchel over one shoulder, and said nothing at all. 18 years of board meetings, contract negotiations, and rooms full of people who assumed things about him before he opened his mouth had taught him exactly one lesson that mattered in that moment. The person who stays calm is the only one whose account anybody believes later. He reached into his breast pocket, touched the pin once, and put his phone in his hand instead. He hit record. Concourse D at Charlotte Douglas moves like a small, self-contained city between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m., 61 departures, roughly 9,400 passengers. A Cinnabon that does more volume before 9 a.m. than most locations do all day. Denise Holloway had worked that concourse long enough to know the rhythm of it better than she knew her own street. She could tell you which gate agents cut corners, which pilots ran late, which flights would be oversold before the app updated. What she couldn't tell you, what she had never once had to ask herself in 18 years, was why she'd scanned Marcus Bellamy's boarding pass 3 separate times before deciding it still wasn't enough. She would have told you, if you'd asked her right then, that she was just being careful. That's what she told her supervisor 40 minutes later. That's what she told the regional director 4 hours after that. Denise Holloway believed all the way down that she had done nothing wrong. That belief is what made her dangerous. A person who knows they're being cruel can be talked out of it. A person who's certain they're being responsible will burn the whole gate down, defending the idea that they were right the entire time. At 8:16, a junior gate agent named Tobias Reyes, 23 years old, 4 months into the job, 3 weeks out of training, watched the whole thing from behind the counter and felt something in his stomach that he didn't have a name for yet. He'd been taught in orientation that random additional screening happened sometimes. Nobody in orientation had told him what to do when the random screening landed. Every single time he'd seen it in 4 months, on the same kind of passenger. He didn't say anything. Not yet. He would remember, later, exactly how that silence felt, sitting in his chest like a stone he'd swallowed on purpose. At 8:19, Denise Holloway told Marcus Bellamy that his ticket would need to be re-verified by a supervisor before he could board. She said it the way you'd explain a delayed flight, bored, procedural, as if she were doing him a favor by not detaining him longer than necessary. She did not apologize for the wait. She did not offer him a seat. She left him standing at the edge of the jet bridge doorway in full view of the boarding line, while families with strollers and men in golf polos walked past him into the plane. Marcus Bellamy had negotiated a $12 million licensing deal without raising his voice once. He had sat across from investors who tried to lowball his company by 40% and watched them fold under nothing but silence and patience. He used those same tools now. He stood still. He said, "Take your time," in a voice so even it made the 2 passengers closest to him stop talking entirely. That's the first frozen moment. The boarding announcements stopped. The rolling suitcase wheels stopped clattering. Somewhere behind the counter, a printer that had been humming continuously All morning finished its job and went quiet. For 4 full seconds, nobody at gate D14 moved, and in that silence, everyone standing there understood, without one single word being spoken, that something was being decided that had nothing to do with paperwork. Escalation number 2 arrived at 8:24. And this is the point where misunderstanding stopped being a word anyone could reasonably use. A supervisor named Craig Pomerantz arrived, reviewed the same boarding pass that had scanned green 4 times now, and instead of clearing Marcus to board, he asked him, in front of the entire remaining boarding line, microphone still live, to confirm how the ticket was purchased. Corporate account, Marcus said. Aerotheon Systems. And you're an employee there? I'm the founder. Craig Pomerantz smiled the smile of a man who has decided he's caught something. We get a lot of, let's call them creative bookings, on corporate accounts. I'm going to need to see additional ID. Marcus had already shown a real ID-compliant North Carolina driver's license, his TSA pre-check card, and the boarding pass. There was no additional ID. There was no regulation requiring one. There was only a growing conviction, shared now by 2 Palisade Airlines employees, that a black man standing in seat 2A's boarding line was, on some level neither of them could articulate, a problem to be solved rather than a passenger to be served. Marcus asked, calmly, what specifically was in question. Denise Holloway answered before Craig could. We just need to make sure everything's legitimate before we let you board, sir. She said, sir. The way some people say a slur without knowing they've done it. Technically polite, entirely hollow, designed to close a conversation rather than continue one. An older woman near the counter, silver-haired, traveling with a small dog carrier, finally spoke. He showed you his ID twice. What exactly is the issue? Nobody answered her either. At 8:31, the flight's departure time came and went. The doors stayed open. Inside the cabin, a flight attendant named Rosa Diaz, 53 years old, 26 years, with Palisade, watched through the small round window in the galley door as a man she'd have normally welcomed aboard. With a smile stood outside, being treated like a security threat. She had seen this exact shape of moment 4 times in her career. Twice, she'd said nothing. Once, she'd quietly moved a passenger to a better seat afterward, as a silent apology that fixed nothing. This time, something in her chest refused to stay quiet, but her feet stayed rooted by the coffee station. Because Rosa Diaz was 11 months from a pension she'd spent 26 years earning, and 11 months felt like a very long time to risk it over a man she'd never met. That's the moral weight this story asks you to sit with. Rosa wasn't a coward. She was a person doing the math that almost everyone does, every single day, when speaking up costs something real. Escalation number 3 came at 8:36, and it was the one nobody in that boarding line would forget. Craig Pomerantz, flanked now by an airport police officer who'd been summoned as a precaution, told Marcus Bellamy that his boarding privileges for that flight were suspended pending identity verification, and that he would need to step away from the gate area entirely. They physically escorted him, not in handcuffs, not violently. But an airport police officer walked beside a man who had done nothing but hand over a valid ticket 4 separate times, past 61 strangers, back through the terminal, away from a flight he had every legal right to be on. Marcus Bellamy did not raise his voice. He did not resist. He recorded every second of it on a phone held low at his hip, and as the officer walked him away from the gate, he said one sentence, quiet enough that only Tobias Reyes, standing near the counter, actually heard it. My father spent 31 years making sure planes like this one took off on time. Nobody ever walked him off a jet bridge for it. Tobias Reyes felt the stone in his stomach turn into something else, something closer to shame. Something closer to Here's what almost nobody in that boarding line knew yet, the piece of information that turns this whole morning from an ugly misunderstanding into something that would end careers by nightfall. Aerotheon Systems didn't just supply Palisade Airlines with scheduling software. 8 months earlier, Aerotheon had signed a $61 million, 5-year contract to overhaul Palisade's entire gate management and boarding verification system. The exact system Denise Holloway had scanned Marcus Bellamy's boarding pass into 4 times on a screen built by his own engineers. Marcus wasn't just a passenger with a valid ticket. He was, functionally, the reason that scanner worked at all. He hadn't said this at the gate. Not once. He didn't need to. He had built his entire career on the belief that the truth should be strong enough to survive without him, announcing his own importance. And he wasn't going to abandon that principle just because 2 employees of an airline he was actively saving money for had decided he didn't belong in seat 2A. At 8:44, in a small administrative office off the concourse, an airport operations duty manager named Felix Ortega pulled up the reservation on his own terminal, the one connected directly to Palisade's corporate systems rather than the gate agent's limited view, and went very quiet. This ticket was purchased under the Aerotheon Systems master corporate account, Felix said, mostly to himself. That's a Tier 1 vendor account. That requires executive sign-off to even exist. He looked up at Craig Pomerantz. Do you know whose company that is? Craig did not. Felix turned his monitor around so Craig could see it. A name, a title, Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Aerotheon Systems. That's the second frozen moment. Craig Pomerantz's mouth opened, and nothing came out of it. Somewhere down the hall, a printer clicked off. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed at a frequency nobody in that office had noticed until the silence made room for it. For nearly 6 full seconds, 3 grown adults in matching Palisade Airlines vests stood in a small windowless office and understood, all at once, exactly how badly they had misjudged the morning. 15 minutes later, a regional vice president named Andrea Whitfield arrived at Gate D15 in person, having been called by Felix and having pulled the contract file herself on the drive over. She did not raise her voice either. She didn't need to. She walked directly up to Marcus Bellamy, who was seated now in the terminal, satchel on his knees, waiting with the same stillness he'd held for the last 40 minutes. And she said, "Mr. Bellamy, I owe you an apology, and I intend to give you a real one, not a scripted one." Denise Holloway, standing 8 feet away, said the sentence that sealed her fate more thoroughly than anything that had come before it. "I was just following protocol. I don't see what I did wrong." Andrea Whitfield turned to look at her. "There is no protocol," she said, "that requires 4 re-verifications of a boarding pass that scanned green on the first try. There is no protocol that requires a police escort off a jet bridge for a ticket holder in good standing. What you followed, Denise, was your own judgment, and your judgment was wrong." Denise did not apologize. Not then, not later that afternoon when she was called into a formal review, not the following week when a company investigator sat across from her with a printed transcript of everything said at that gate. She said, 4 separate times, in 4 separate meetings, some version of the same sentence. "I was just being thorough." That refusal is the thing that finished her. The investigation that followed didn't stay contained to one Thursday morning. Palisade Airlines' internal compliance office pulled Denise Holloway's full service file, and what they found wasn't one bad decision. It was a pattern, sitting in plain sight for years, that nobody had bothered to add up until now. Over the previous 4 years, there had been 11 formal passenger complaints filed against Denise Holloway specifically. 9 of the 11 involved Black or Latino passengers holding premium cabin tickets who described being subjected to repeated document checks, unexplained delays, or public questioning that other passengers in the same boarding line never experienced. 2 of those complaints had come from passengers who never got to board their original flights at all. One had been quietly settled with a $1,200 travel voucher, and a request for a signed non-disclosure agreement. All 11 complaints had been logged, reviewed by a single mid-level manager, marked resolved, no pattern identified, and filed away without ever reaching anyone with the authority to actually do something about it. The system hadn't missed the pattern. The system had been built, without anyone quite intending it, to absorb the pattern and keep it invisible. Andrea Whitfield terminated Denise Holloway's employment 8 days later. Not a suspension, not a quiet reassignment to a smaller regional airport with a severance check attached. Termination with cause on the record, with a personnel file that would follow her to any future employer who bothered to call for a reference. Craig Pomerantz was placed on a 90-day performance improvement plan requiring completion of a bias awareness and de-escalation certification before he could return to any customer-facing role. He completed it. Whether it changed anything in him, nobody could say for certain. But he never again worked Gate D14, and he never again supervised a boarding process without a second manager present, per new company policy. Tobias Reyes did the thing that mattered most, 3 days after the incident, and it wasn't loud. He submitted a written statement to the investigators, unprompted, describing exactly what he'd seen and exactly how long he'd stayed silent while seeing it. He didn't frame it as heroism. In his statement, he wrote one sentence that Andrea Whitfield would later read aloud, without his permission, in a mandatory training session for every gate agent at Charlotte Douglas. "I knew it was wrong while it was happening, and I said nothing, and I don't ever want to be the kind of person who does that again." Rosa Diaz retired 11 months later, exactly on schedule, with her full pension. Before she left, she requested one thing from Palisades Training Department, that her final assignment be teaching the new mandatory course on passenger dignity to incoming flight crew. She told her first class of new hires about a gate she'd once stood 8 feet away from, and a decision she didn't make in time, and she said, "I'm not telling you this so you'll think well of me. I'm telling you this so that when it's your turn you move faster than I did." Marcus Bellamy never gave a single television interview about that morning. He turned down 4 requests, including one from a national morning show that offered to fly him to New York on a private jet, which he found privately almost funny enough to accept, just for the irony of it. What he did instead, 4 months later, was something almost nobody outside Charlotte Douglas Airport ever heard about. He funded a scholarship at Central Piedmont Community College's Aviation Maintenance and Ground Operations program, $2. $4 million, structured to run for at least 15 years, covering full tuition, equipment, and a paid apprenticeship for 40 students, a year training to become baggage handlers, ramp agents, and ground crew. He named it the Walter Bellamy Ground Crew Fellowship, after a man who spent 31 years making sure planes took off on time and never once got to sit in one of the seats he made possible. At the small dedication ceremony, held in a maintenance hangar rather than a hotel ballroom, Marcus didn't give a speech about prejudice or justice, or any of the words a documentary narrator might reach for. He stood in front of 40 new students in donated work boots and a few dozen current ground crew members, still in their reflective vests, reached into his breast pocket and held up a small, tarnished airline wing pin. "My father wore something like this for 31 years, he said. "Nobody ever asked to see his ID 4 times to prove he belonged on this ramp. I'd like it to stay that way for the people standing here today." He didn't mention Denise Holloway's name. He didn't need to. Everyone in that hangar who'd worked at Charlotte Douglas in the last decade already knew exactly which morning he meant. Somewhere in Nashville, 6 months after her termination, Denise Holloway was working the front desk of a regional car rental counter, no uniform badge, no gate to run, no scanner in front of her deciding, for her, who deserved a second look and who didn't. She still told people, when it came up, that she'd only ever been thorough. Nobody who'd read the file believed her anymore. That's the part of this story that doesn't get a redemption arc. Because some people never take the version of the story that lets them change. Marcus Bellamy still flies out of Charlotte Douglas every few weeks. He still sits in first class. He still carries his father's pin in his breast pocket every single flight, and he still says nothing about who he is unless somebody asks him directly. Because the whole point, the thing his father tried to tell him a long time ago in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and shoe polish, was never about proving he belonged in that seat. It was about a system finally being forced to notice that it never had the right to ask. If you were standing in that boarding line at gate D14, watching a man get walked off a jet bridge for a ticket that scanned green 4 times, would you have said something? Or would you have told yourself, like almost everyone else did that morning, that there must have been a reason? That question doesn't have an easy answer. Maybe that's exactly why it's worth sitting with.